If they asked me, I could write a book about the way you walk and whisper and look. I could write a preface on how we met, so the world would never forget. And the simple.
I was always curious about the sort of ceremonies and ways in which ordinary people lived their lives in the area I grew up in.
Then the world discovered.
I remember very clearly the kind of ballet of women and men playing bowls, and this kind of elaborate calling out to one another.
Just a yard put.
Laura, you've got that line, just not quite right there. Have another go. Excellent, well done there. There was no high-fiving, there was no self-congratulations. It was just a kind of an enjoyment, and yet you had this outdoor chess taking place. Whatever was played on the bandstand, we never listened. Like my sister's music box, forgotten on the landing, spinning away in its hall of mirrors. The tennis pavilion, wooden and green, was for the men. Tattooed arms at the pebbly windows. Bylaws relating to parks and cemeteries. The tall houses blindly surrounded, the knock of bowls, and someone calling out their instructions to ladies all dressed in white. On a bad night, the foghorn sounded like a muffled drum. People kept in. It'd be a sin to go out in a night like that, and they watched whatever passes. Later, when silence fell, you'd lie there wide awake, listening for raised voices and the passion that cries out of the ordinary. I've always been fascinated how a certain image will hold inside itself a kind of undisclosed truth. Beauty is found in every kind of little thing. My sister was given a music box one Christmas, and I can still hear the music as the ballerina moved around. There's different little details like that. But also the foghorns, I mean, you could hear them coming out from the loch. There was a kind of slightly gothic quality to Belfast early afternoons, early nights, because it seemed to be dark a lot. And also the notion of passion as something that comes out of ordinary life. It's not something that descends upon you. I had a sense of that in the ending of the poem. The narrator of the poem lying awake at night and hearing raised voices from the street, but also hearing or imagining the sounds of love. And the way colloquially, the way people use that word sin, it's on the gable ends and it's on the big churches, you know, sinners and sin. And it was part of that landscape growing up. But it also was kind of depowered by the way, I mean, people would say, that's a terrible sin, that now. And it kind of takes the heat out of the big notion of sin. I was very pleased when I got that poem. It was included in a book called Sunday School, which is about that kind of Protestant upbringing and its ramifications around me.
To be honest, I think I paid no attention to it at all in the very beginning of time because I thought he was just rabbiting on, sitting down there writing stuff. I was off doing my own thing and, you know, he'd still be inside with the type. I bought him a typewriter for £16, which was a second-hand one I found in Kilkenny.
It's huge.
It was an old, what was it, an old Smith typewriter.
Yeah.
And he'd be in there pounding away at it, you know. And I thought, God, you know, here we go again. But meeting his family made it real, you know. And certainly, as time went on, I began to really appreciate what he was writing and enjoy reading it, you know, because as I freely admitted to him, I never had any truck with modern poetry at all. I'd never read T.S. Eliot until I went to university. It was Shakespeare, Wordsworth, all the classical English poets, not Irish poets. So I really began to appreciate it and understand the world that Jerry was part of. But it did take a while. I came to love Belfast. I came to love it through Jerry's eyes.
My mother was really an archivist, and she handed on stuff to me over many years. She kind of was like a family chronicler. One of the things that she kept was this. It's from September 5th, 1929, and it's the Daily Mirror, Who is the Prettiest Girl in Ireland, Daily Mirror search. And here's my grandmother, Miss Ethel Bradshaw of Belfast. It says 1929, so she would have been married at that stage. So I'm wondering, was she telling a little porky by calling herself Miss rather than Mrs.? I just thought it was a nice piece of social history. The hairstyles and everything are just extraordinary. I don't know who won I don't know who was named the prettiest girl in Ireland.
I'm stepping out with a memory tonight.
And the other piece is slightly more of a personal value to me. This is my mother's wedding. This is Norma, my mother, and her bridesmaid, Pamela Sproul. And this is my father, Gordon Aubrey Dawe. I don't know who his aide-de-camp is here, his pal. But they're both in their army uniforms. And Mum told me that she made this dress herself. She's 18 there, just as war's coming to an end. The marriage lasted about 10 years. And I didn't know him. I met him once subsequent to the breakup. I was 5 or 6 when they separated. And I met him by a pure fluke, standing in a bus queue in Belfast. He passed away a few years ago. And one of the intriguing things about that from a personal point of view is that when they cleared this house out, they discovered that he'd kept a file, a box file of cuttings and photographs of my journey as a writer. One of the things that has always fascinated me is the way in which a photograph can hold a social or private history in itself. And this particular photograph, the wedding, the photograph of my mother and father, has a kind of resonance because I remember my mother talking about it and talking about the suit that she was wearing on her wedding day. Their wedding photograph. How the four of you look to be standing to attention and slightly apart is baffling. And a hint of a walk about to take place. I made that suit myself. And your best friend, Pamela Sproul, I can even remember her name as if I was there, with husband and best man. As the war winds down, all will step out of frame into whatever the future holds. In 1956-57, my mother left the family home in Downview and moved in with my grandmother. I think it was supposed to be an interim measure, but it's dead. So I grew up then as a young boy from my 5, 6, 7 years of age in this house with my mother, my sister and my grandmother and my grandmother's friends and my mother's friends and my sister's friends. So it was a house of women, all very formidable individuals too. But there was one of the friends of my grandmother who I was particularly in awe of. I fell in love with her, I think, as a young boy. Her name was Anne, or Annie Orr. She had roaring red hair. She used to wear this very rich red lipstick, and she smoked non-tip cigarettes. She was from a Catholic background from Cliftonville Road. She was very warm, very affectionate, very loving woman. But I think she carried inside herself the damage of sectarianism that Belfast was. And I had grown up in an environment where sectarianism didn't exist inside the family. It did make me realise that I lived a kind of slightly special sort of a life. But Annie brought me into that world, and for that I'm forever in her debt. So it really was quite an interesting environment for a young boy. My grandmother Ethel was a singer. She was a light opera singer, and I think she had a semi-professional life doing that in the 20s. And by all accounts, she had a beautiful voice. She also taught poetry and voice production, so her anthologies were there with her handwriting. And then there were some books of poetry that she'd been given. So there was this kind of cultural matter in the house. But the sounds of the house were the radio. That was only off when we were asleep.
Melody on the Move this morning was played by the BBC Northern Ireland Light Orchestra. Now the time is 9 o'clock. Time for Housewife's Choice, introduced by Richard Murdoch.
That was like an oral backdrop to my childhood. She also taught piano and singing. I used to hate it because it'd go back over and over and over again. It was almost like a form of torture. She taught elocution, or voice production as it was called in those days.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plains.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plains.
I used to arrive in on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and she taught how to speak English properly.
Do you see these three marbles? I want you to put them in your mouth. Yes, 1, 2, 3. Now don't be alarmed, it's just an exercise. Now then, repeat slowly after me. The shallow depression in the west of these islands is likely to move slowly in a westerly direction.
The shallow depression in the west of these islands is likely to move. Look. Larry, I've swallowed one.
Don't worry, we have plenty more.
She had a table where the students would sit at, and a beautiful mirror. She used to get them to look at themselves speaking and opening their mouths, and they would look at this. It was all for diction. And the next thing you would hear is her voice. And she had a little kind of like a baton. She'd be beating on the table the pace in which they were saying their poem. I wander lowly as a cloud, dun, dun, dun. And you'd hear them. I think she must have been a wonderful teacher because she was so even-tempered, calm. So all that interaction happened when I was barely conscious of what was going on. But before we left that place, I gathered up the anthologies. And I was probably maybe 11, 12, 13, and I started to become interested in why she had picked certain poems to recite. So that poetry became a spoken thing, a speech thing, as well as something that's on the page. So that when I started to write poems with that unconsciously in mind. Elocution Day. When I am back in the long avenue, the houses glow, and equal squares of lawn drip with lilac and hydrangea. Behind judicious curtains and cut glass vase, my grandmother mimes vowels from a poem by Longfellow. As a neighbour's daughter, bobby socks and high heels, copies her. And in the long avenue it starts to rain lightly.
champagne. Ladies, listen to me, they thought of you and me. Night they invented champagne.
Everything I knew, everything that was in the house, everything that we bought, everything that we listened to, the channels through which we heard music on the radio, when the television arrived, it was all British. The Billy Cotton show on a Saturday night. His name and his orchestra was a kind of consolation to people who remembered him during the war. Everything was referred back through to the war. So that these artists, who were now in a new world in the 50s, they were providing entertainment. But in the back of people's minds, there was when they heard them, how they heard what they were singing, and when they were. So that there was a kind of etched in my mother's generation, entertainment was interconnected with the war.
Welcome back to the Wakey Wakey Tavern after her pantomime season. Our own sweet singer of sweet songs. Here she is, Kathy Kay.
I will love you as I love you all my life.
It was kind of sedatives that were coming in your ear.
Makes me more content with you.
It was simple entertainment. And I'd hear my mother, you know, she'd be in the house somewhere and she'd sing along. So there was a kind of sense of community. So what the BBC and when the ITV came along, UTV came along, what it was providing was a sense of confirmation, of integration of Britishness. There were the comics that we all read, which were based around male characters, which conveyed war stories through cartoon format. And they were glorifications of war in many ways and the victory of the Allied forces. And they underwrote our Britishness. The comics also included the sports comics, where Roy the Rover and all these different characters were inhabiting this imaginary football team. Our ceremonies were tied to the British state and the royal family.
The Duke of Edinburgh lays the wreath, a simpler one of Flanders poppies and laurel, on behalf of the Queen and himself.
Everything was connected in with Britain. Everything. There was no sense of another world. One of the big draws for me was football. I love football.
Winger Peter Harris led the way to Portsmouth's first attack, a move that had the fans on tiptoe.
All these clubs were based in England. There were Manchester or Liverpool or London. My club, I supported Spurs for most of my younger years, and then I did the unforgivable thing and moved to Manchester United. Some friends of mine still don't talk to me about that.
Division 1, Sunderland 2, Spurs 0. Here's a repetition now of that Division 2 result, and it confirms the original result, Ipswich 0, Birmingham 1. Second division in Scotland, Stranraer 1, Ayr United 5.
The Net is part of 6 scenes from a book that was published back in 1985 called The Lundy's Letter. Each of the scenes are set cinematically almost in the environment of North Belfast. They're based around memories of church and social life and so on. And one of the moments that such strong impact on me or on my memory was hearing the sound of the crowd down at Seaview Football Club. He would carry on the wind up the avenue to us, so you could hear almost like corn moving in a field, the sound of the supporters oohing and aahing as a match was underway. This one was called The Net, and it's the third of the 6 scenes. The net is both the football net but it's also the net that held us all together in some kind of fashion. And I mentioned one of the great footballers of the time. The net. Bimbo Weatherup hammers one in. The crowd goes daft. The train shoots past. On the hill in front of us, the houses stretch up like a ladder from the shore to Antrim Road. In between is where we are, backs to the sea. The house was a busy place, and then when my grandmother died, somewhat unexpectedly, I think, in 1960, she was quite young, my mother took over the house and the running of the house. So there was my mother, my sister, and myself. She was very hospitable, very kindly woman. I think that produced this atmosphere in the house where people liked being there. She had a kind of self-confidence which sat kind of easily inside the house, but when we moved outside the house, I think there were kind of anxieties as a single mother. Belfast was a very prudish place. It was very conventional, and coming from a family of serial divorcees, my grandmother and my mother, that would have been known amongst some of these people, and there was a sense of, you know, that they had gone against the flow of what ordinary Belfast women are expected to do. So there was a slight sense of the unconventional in the house. The cinema was hugely important to my mother's generation. Not so much to me for some reason, but all her music came through the cinema. She used to go religiously 2-3 times a week. And that music fed into the house as well. So we'd have albums of the soundtrack to this movie or that movie. Things like the Eddie Duchin story. I only really became conscious of the popular music when my uncle returned from the RAF, and he would bring back music and also a radiogram which he played music on. And that's when I started to hear jazz. And that's when I realized that my mother loved jazz. And she took to it like a duck to water. She really loved it and she played it. And you'd hear Ella Fitzgerald, who was a big favourite in our house. My mother loved her. She actually kind of idolised her.
I fell in love with you the first time I looked at them there eyes. You got a cute little certain way of flirting with them there eyes.
There was one particular night I remember very clearly. She went out with a neighbour of ours, an Austrian lady, a refugee, to see Ella Fitzgerald in Belfast. She was playing a gig.
Watch out if your wise brown eyes, they sparkle, gonna get you in a whole lot of trouble. There's danger lurking, you're overworking them their eyes.
I remember when she arrived back, there was a definite change in voltage in the house when she came in. And, you know, I would have been about 7 or 8 at the time. So these things was hard to compute what was going on. But she seemed to be kind of airy. That's the only way I can describe it. She said it was a great concert. She couldn't believe seeing Ella Fitzgerald.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
She said she had a wonderful dress on.
Thank you so much.
And she had a handkerchief that she was using to mop her brow when she was singing. The music was great and so on. But then she said something I'd never heard her say before, and it becomes the last 2 words in the poem. And it's about the transformation, without overdoing it, the transformation of what happens when music takes you over.
I die a little every time
It's 1960 or thereabouts in the terrace of 7 houses, Upper North Side. The blackout blind's still up, but things are steadily improving. Shops stay open late. The light falls in rectangles from the windows. Trolley buses clang and clank. The mill of people going to movies, meetings, dances, to the boat, to the club, to church, and to Ella.
From major to minor, every time we say.
The only thing my mother says when she comes back home is, "I'm sent."
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
When my mother passed away in 2011, I discovered that she had kept a quite substantial archive of photographs, cuttings, different memorabilia from her past. This first one is, I would say, about 1906 or maybe 07. And it shows my grandmother, Ethel Rebecca Charters, the child in the middle, with her parents, William Billy Charters and Mary Jane Courts. Mary Jane is an interesting figure. She is becoming more interesting to me as time moves on. Her father was in the Irish Hussars, and the registration of her birth is in Longford in the military camp. And then she moved with her parents to India, and those stories in India were handed on from her to her daughter. Ethel handed on those stories to my mother, and my mother then handed those stories on to me. And it was her life as the daughter of a regimental sergeant major in India, where they were stationed. I found absolutely intriguing. That's Billy there, with his Gladstone collar, and I don't think it's a coronation. Maybe it is. I can't properly see. But that's Billy with his flower in his lapel, which he was known for. He's a dapper individual, nice glasses, moustache, typical of the time, and he's staring straight at the camera. There's nothing uncertain about that face. He was a Huguenot from a Huguenot family, and they had entered into Ireland as refugees, as exiles. He had probably moved up the profession by that time, and was doing well. He was in the sports department of the Belfast Telegraph. As things transpired, he moved up through the Orange Order. He was very connected into the Unionist Party. He was a 32-county Unionist. He believed that the island of Ireland should remain inside the Union. And when that didn't happen, apparently he was very upset. Without being unfair on the man, I think there were two Billies. There was a Billy that was outside the front door, who performed as a member of the elite. And there was a Billy inside the house. I kind of identify him as an Edwardian figure wrapped up inside this other world of Belfast unionism. Perhaps it's justifiably caricatured as being stern, puritanical, harsh. But clearly there was a space inside that for someone like Billy and his wife to operate, because they handed on none of those characteristics to their daughters, none of those to their granddaughters, and none of those to their great-grandchildren. When I started to think and write about these issues, it presented a challenge to me, because I had not really given much thought to where I had come from. So the writing became a way in which I started to explore the past. And the more I started to do that, the more I started to realize that there are more stories to Northern Ireland than the standard narratives, and that it's important to start to open those stories up.
It's a wonderful world. I'm just walking on air.
This train is for Bangor. The next station is
I've got
Sidland.
more than my share. Haven't got a care.
I remember the excitement leaving North Belfast on a taxi,
It's a wonderful world.
getting to the station,
Loving wonderful you.
going on the short train journey.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful world. I'm just walking on air.
And getting out of the train in Bangor,
Talking about heaven on earth. I got more than my share. Haven't got a care.
and then finally getting to the sea. I mean, it was a wonderful experience.
It's just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful world. Loving wonderful you.
There are two Bangors for me. The first Bangor is the Bangor of my childhood, when my grandmother and then subsequently my mother took a house there during the July fortnight. Ice cream, hanging out on the strand, going out to Picky Pool. That was a wonderful Bangor. That was that Bangor which would be the Bangor of the 50s and early 60s.
I'm just walking on air.
So that was my first Bangor. My second Bangor was when I started to head down there with my chums, my pals, my mates from Belfast. We used to go down there fairly regularly. I'm almost certain we saw the small faces in Caproni's at one time. I mean, it was a sun-filled time. A lot of people used to hang out down along the promenade and you chat up girls. There was a lot of social interaction. There was also the evangelicals and their singing, the way in which they proselytized, I suppose is the word. They used to hand out tracts, and there would be lots of singing of hymns, and it was a very energetic kind of singing that would go on, followed by, memory serves me right, by the occasional sermon. My mother, being the irreverent woman that she was, used to hurry us along, so we didn't make eye contact, and we would have to in some way sit in the pews here. But it was a busy spot. He that hath the Son hath life, and he that hath not the Son of God hath not life. You must be born again. It's time to seek the Lord. I mean, it was a big deal, and there was lots of people here who believed, and still do believe passionately in that language. Morning worship 11 a.m., evening service 7, Sunday school 3 p.m. Special singing and testimonies. The testimony was what used to always intrigue us. That someone would stand up and give their testimony, their witness to the Lord, and say exactly how they had come on the path of righteousness. You in your small corner and I in mine. There were songs for children and there were songs for adults. And I suppose the entire reason for this was to bring pleasure into the lives of those who believed in this great way of religion, of the Protestant way of life. And it sat in a kind of strange way when you think about it civically. It sat between the pleasure grounds of Picky Pool and the homes and the guest houses behind us as a constant reminder that you were here for a certain reason. And it wasn't just pleasure. I mean, I do remember along the Strand here, hundreds and hundreds of people in their deck chairs. That's what we did. That was our holidays. Looking back now, I do remember sitting in one of those deck chairs, looking out on that vista out there and thinking about the world beyond. It wasn't a conscious thought, it was just, I wonder what's next, what's through there. It's kind of funny that everywhere I've lived, it's been by the sea. When I was a student, I lived in Portstewart. When I moved to the west of Ireland, I lived in Galway. I moved to Dunleary in the 90s. Living by the sea has been an ongoing part of my life since the early 50s when I was a kid running around this strand here. I now realise, looking back, I was intrigued that language became a thing that you used, a thing that was entertainment, it was something that you manipulated. Then when I went to school in Orangefield, I had a wonderful teacher called Sam McCready, and Sam had also a great interest in drama. He got a lot of us involved in the Lyric Youth Theatre. I started to get interested doing my O-levels in reading a little bit outside the box. There's the shipyard down there. School is gone. Completely gone. Both schools, the boys' school and the girls' school, was down in there in that hollow. It is a shame that there's no monument, there's nothing, no sign that I can see of anything that there was a school here for 70 years. It's a real shame. There was a kind of little sort of confluence of things were going on. There was a play by Dennis Potter called The Son of Man, which was broadcast on BBC. I remember watching it and being intrigued by just the language that was used.
Look, I bring you the answer, I bring you the way. I'm holding up a light in the darkness. Oh, listen, 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 listen to me, brothers and sisters, listen to me.
A few days later, in a science notebook, I sat down and I wrote this poem called From This Time Without. Now, it was an absolutely dreadful poem. And as it turned out, a very dear friend of mine at the time, his sister was being taught by Michael Longley. I gave this poem to Gary, and Gary gave the poem to his sister Anne, and Anne gave it to Michael, and Michael posted it back to me. With lots of recommendations. But at the bottom of the poem, he gave me 6 names of those people I should read. And that really launched me into reading contemporary poetry. And at that point, as I was turning into my 16th year, I felt very much that this is what I wanted to do with my life. I just felt very comfortable about working with language. Reading poetry was an obsession. And I felt that if I could, I'd like to try and write more. My life had been very much a part of the family house. It was only when I started to travel from North Belfast to East Belfast, going to school, that the city centre opened itself up. The weekend was completely given over to gigs, dancing and going to live music. So many of the venues around town. And you'd meet your girlfriends outside the Linnenhall Library or the Wimpy Bar steps. And it was a fairly regular thing, you know, the bus would arrive in every Friday, Saturday night. Mystery train. It was a kind of fairly full-on social life. Mystery train. And it was wonderful because, you know, we were actually hearing stuff in transistors and then seeing the bands in town. And you'd be watching things like Top of the Pops, and the following day you'd be talking about what you saw the night before, you know, who was on. Did you see the Kinks last night? Oh, yeah, you really got me now. There was a kind of ongoing sense of being not consciously part of a new generation, but definitely, unquestionably, there was a feeling that we weren't looking over our shoulder about what had happened in the war. We weren't looking back and saying, you know, are you a Protestant, are you a Catholic? That kind of divisiveness, not for any conscious reason, it just wasn't there. It was like static crackling on the edges of our lives.
Downtown would walk.
One of the things was the exhilaration of having great music produced by Northern Irish musicians, the Few, Sam Mahood and the Just Five, Frankie Connolly and the Sticks, so many of them.
It is his man.
But I suppose the one that burst through was Them.
Just dirty enough to say.
And then you started to hear them on the radio. You started to see them around town. You'd often see Van around, getting the Gilnahert bus. And there was one occasion I remember very, very clearly. It was towards the end of summer. We were all hanging out around the City Hall. And somebody had a small little transistor. The next thing is we could hear Van on the radio. And somebody says, and there he is. And he was walking around the side of the City Hall. So it was kind of like there was I mean, nobody would ever have, shouted out on or looked for his autograph, or that just wasn't the kind of thing you did. But under the radar, there was a huge sense of being chuffed.
And man, 4 pints of that scrumpy was enough to have you out of your mind.
And then when you listen to the lyrics, the story of Them talks about Royal Avenue and Scrumpy Rooms, and these were all places that we knew, they were named.
Started playing in the Maritime. That's Jerry, and Jimmy. You know, they were always fine, and they helped us run the Maritime.
Well, this is the site, according to the blue plaque, of the Maritime.
You'd go upstairs into this area. It was like a cavern, really. The intriguing thing is that the band would walk through the auditorium and go on stage. So it was a very democratic kind of environment. This is Holy Land. This is sacred ground.
People say, who are or what are them?
It was a kind of like a little bubble of time from 63 to 69, and then it started to run out because literally Belfast became dangerous.
It began with stones and abuse hurled between Protestants and Catholics as a weekend Protestant march passed a block of council flats. And it snowballed into street fighting of a ferocity and bitterness not seen in the city since the 1930s.
By 72, 73, that had taken over. And the fabric or the cement that kept that little group of young men and women together, that had fragmented. It has remained in my mind as a salutary lesson of the impact that social violence has on society, the way in which it teared apart a fabric which had been there. The 60s offered a real chance, but the weight of generational tension and the sense in which the conservatism of the Northern Irish state married into or merged with a British state which was actually disinterested in pushing forward reform. It was almost inevitable that what happened happened. Any sectarian tone, any bigoted comment, any looking down the nose, or any bitterness didn't attach itself to us. And the only reason I can think why, it's not that we were hippies or flower power people, because we weren't. It was because it seemed like something out of another age, another time. It seemed like something that didn't belong. So my understanding is that as we lived through those years, we discovered what we weren't. And what we weren't was bigoted. At a certain point, you move on. And by 1971, 72, that had started to happen. I was 20. My life changed significantly when I moved up to college in Coleraine. But there were times when I got back to Belfast and I worked as a postman in Christmas time. I'd never seen poverty before. I'd never seen it before. That had a big impact on me. I remember being very, very angry that people had been allowed to live in those conditions. It opened the door on the sectarianism. That job as a postman had opened my eyes to the other side of Belfast life. I was outraged that a society which spoke so much about religion and all the spiritual values associated could let people suffer in that way.
Just as in 1969, the great move-out is on. All over this city today, whole families are abandoning their homes. The Protestants are leaving the Catholic streets. The Catholics are going from the Protestant streets.
There was a magazine called McGill. It published a retrospective of the Troubles, 10 years of the Troubles it was. And they had some wonderful photographs. And one of them was a clock, one of those old, very traditional mantelpiece clocks, sitting on a wall. It seemed to read 7:30. At the back, there was a row of houses which had been set aflame. So I wrote this poem in the voice of the clock. Now, I know that sounds a bit tricky, but it seemed to me to work. It's one of those poems that I was proud to write as an elegy of a time. I am the clock on a wall of Farrington Gardens. I stopped dead at 7:30. They tried to take me away from the burning. I remember the whooshing smoke. But in the rush, I was left here as if nothing had happened. Part of my task is not to get panicked. I'm regular and reliable and wake each morning for work, a bulwark of my society. But when the fire started and the windows cracked like ice, I was snatched up and out under the sky to sit defenseless. My springs and coils and deep chiming stopped at 7:30. So, if you come across me in your reading, a photo perhaps in some glossy history, remember the blackened walls and roofless houses, of what went on before the three monkeys and the chipped mantelpieces, in the backs of sculleries and in front bedrooms, before the televisions landed in tidily grown gardens. Think just a little of my time watching these different people who left their lives in my hands, sitting on a wall of Farrington Gardens. Dara and I had gone to Belfast to a book launch. It wasn't really a launch, it was just a little party that Pádraig Fake, the poet, had put on. We met a young poet, a lovely lad called Jerry McLaughlin, Jerry Locke, he published under. He was striving, like the rest of us, to write poems and publish them. only a few months later, and I think it was April of 75, I was in the apartment in the flat. Dawe was up at the university, and I had the radio on. And I was doing something, I can't remember what it was. But my ears picked up about someone had been found shot dead, and it was Jerry. Jerry had been going into a shop and had been murdered by some loyalist gang. But it really absolutely threw me into the deepest of depressions. He had a spark, there's no question about it. He would have gone on and achieved a lot in his life, but it was taken from him by the Troubles. Count. My only problem is your death. When the radio was stuttering over breakfast in this flat, the predicted west gale welting round our postage-stamp garden, a fat crow crouched under the wall, and the early morning warmth dazed, an impractical consciousness footering with cups, toast laid in their apparent order when first I heard your name. It sounded crazy, somehow or other as incoherent as a dream. Your name, age, place of birth, and then the on-the-spot commentary, reasoning details of how and why they waited in a car for you coming out of a huckster shop with cigarettes and pumped 6 bullets, 5 when you sprawled on the street. It's hard to make that count. The boy that did it was a few years younger. 20 years, 6 bullets, 9 in the morning. I toy like a child with these numbers. So this was my first book, published in 1978. And looking back at it now, over all these years, I see how much it's a book characterized by a young man trying to come to terms with what is happening to the city that he grew up in.
I had a problem with this book because obviously it was his first book, but when I read it, there was nothing in my mind, there was nothing joyful in it. So I thought, this is a book that he has written in this very sad world that he has inhabited. But the work changed as time went on, as we know. And this will remain, I suppose, the initial output. But I do think it was scarred by the Troubles, I have no doubt about it.
It's a war book. It's a book of war poems, I think, now. Belfast is a walkable city. Take the Troubles out of it, it's a walkable place. Those wonderful boulevard avenues which run from the mountainscapes down into the city. Ormeau, Crumlin, Falls, Shankill, Dunkern, Antrim Roads, Craigie. It's a wonderful city to walk around. When I was growing up, that was possible. During the Troubles, it wasn't possible. Today, in most places, it's becoming possible again. So my sense of Belfast now is it's going back to the 60s. The possibility that was available in the 60s and that was closed down by the violence has reseeded itself in a younger generation. And also the obvious fact that Belfast has now become what it was underground. It has now become a multicultural society. That was kind of kept under wraps in my time. Now, I'm not saying it's all high five. There are challenges and there are still prejudices there. There's no question about that. But when I see these days of colourful celebration and think back to 1965, 66, it's a different world. But today's liberation is, I think, more rooted now, and it won't be blown off course. I cannot see the achievements of the younger generation being blown off course by violence or sectarianism. I just can't see it. It's taken too long and it's rooted too deeply. Writing poems to me is the reason that has kept me going. Some of the darkest times of my life, it has been something that has allowed me to shape what is happening. And also I hope to celebrate things in my life, great things in my life that has happened. People that I know and love, and to celebrate them and to commemorate their lives, to sing their praises without being too pretentious about it. I always think that poetry has a function. From a lullaby to a song of praise in church, to an incantation around a fire, any shaping of language into song, lyric, music has value. How many people get involved in that, how many people are aware of it, how many people attend to it is another story. But for me, poetry always has a function. And its function is to bring people into a kind of circle in which they can think about things, think about themselves, be challenged, be amused, be entertained, to just share their common humanity in language. If poetry isn't pleasurable, if the listening to and the reciting and the auditing of poetry isn't pleasurable, I don't know what the point of it is. I think my grandmother taught that to me when I could overhear her encouraging young Belfast girls and boys to recite Wordsworth or a Scottish ballad. I always thought that, well, there's your reason. There's your reason. They're listening to something that is shaped, and they'll never forget that. Being in love with poetry is really being in love with life. And I know that sounds a bit cliche, but it's true.
Feel when I dance with you. We move like the sea.